In the 29th year of Ramses III, the men who built eternity put down their tools. They lived at el-Medina, a walled village beside the cliffs of ancient Thebes, and their work was unlike ordinary labor. They carved corridors into royal tombs, painted the walls of the dead, and prepared hidden chambers where pharaohs expected to live forever. They were skilled, literate, and employed by the most powerful state on earth. But their grain rations had not arrived. Days passed. Their families waited. The workers crossed out of the royal necropolis, entered temple grounds, and refused to return. They complained that hunger had driven them there. Officials offered promises and partial payments, but a promise could not be ground into flour. The event survives in a document now known as the Strike Papyrus, the earliest recorded labor strike in history. It did not begin over abstract rights. It began because the state had failed to deliver bread. That is the first secret of this story. In ancient Egypt, bread was not simply something placed beside a meal. It was salary, obligation, ritual, military supply, and political stability. A state that raised temples and commanded armies still depended on grain reaching households on time. When it failed, the work of the pharaoh stopped. So how did crushed seeds, water, and heat become powerful enough to challenge a king? To answer that, the story must move backward more than 10,000 years, before Egypt, before cities, before kings, and before anyone had planted a field. In what is now northeastern Jordan, hunter-gatherers gathered wild cereals and underground plants, cleaned them, crushed them on stone, mixed the powder with water, and placed small pieces of dough against heat. The result was a flat, unleavened bread-like food. It was made roughly 14,400 years ago, thousands of years before established agriculture in that region. Most people imagine the order differently. First, humans invented farming. Then grain became abundant. Then someone eventually invented bread. But that is not what the evidence suggests. Bread, or something close to it, appeared before the farm. And it was not convenient. Wild seeds were small. Gathering them took time. Grinding them demanded effort. Fuel had to be collected, stones prepared, and the mixture carefully cooked. It may have been food for gatherings or feasts, something more valuable and shareable than ordinary plants. That reversal changes the story. Humans may not have settled down and then discovered bread. The desire to make grain foods more reliably may have helped pull them toward cultivation. The loaf did not simply emerge from civilization. It may have helped make civilization desirable, but desire alone could not produce bread every day. Regular bread required a machine larger than any oven, and that machine was the settled community. Fields had to be cleared. Seeds had to be selected. Planting had to happen at the right moment. People watched seasons, defended crops, coordinated harvests, dried the grain, and stored enough for the next cycle. Grinding stones wore down bodies. Fuel was gathered. Ovens were built and repaired. A loaf that looked simple at the end carried an entire calendar inside it. Grain offered something extraordinary in return. Unlike meat, fruit, or milk, it could remain edible for long periods when properly stored. It could be measured, divided, moved, saved, and exchanged. It made the future physically visible in a granary. Yet stability came with a price. Fields could not follow migrating herds. Stored grain had to be guarded. A failed harvest could trap hundreds of people in the same place with the same empty stores. The solution created property, schedules, walls, and dependence. Humans gained predictability, but they surrendered part of their freedom to the harvest. Bread solved an ancient problem, then created a new one. Once survival had been stored in one place, someone had to decide who owned it. That question helped create bureaucracy. In the first cities of Mesopotamia, grain entered temple storehouses and administrative compounds in enormous quantities. Workers delivered crops. Laborers received rations. Messengers, builders, and officials had to be supplied. The larger the settlement became, the harder it was to rely on memory. Someone needed to know how much grain had arrived, who had worked, and what each person was owed. So quantities were pressed into clay. Marks represented commodities, numbers, and portions. Some of the oldest surviving written records are not poems, myths, or royal speeches. They are accounts. They track food, labor, and obligations. One early symbol even shows a human head beside bread, a compact image of a person receiving a ration. This is one of history's great reversals. Writing, which would later carry philosophy, law, science, and literature, first grew inside systems trying to count things like grain and beer. A clay tablet could remember what a human supervisor might forget or deny. For the worker, those marks could determine whether a household ate. For institutions, they turned people and harvests into manageable quantities. Bread had moved beyond the oven. It was now helping create records, offices, authorized measures, and permanent obligations. A solution becomes valuable. Value attracts power. Power builds rules. And once rulers learned to count grain, they could do more than distribute it. They could tax it, seize it, and use it to command labor. No civilization made that relationship more visible than Egypt. In Egyptian workshops, grain was ground, dough kneaded, and loaves shaped to be counted, transported, and offered. Bread and beer were often produced together because both emerged from grain, water, fermentation, and organized labor. Models placed in tombs show miniature bakeries and breweries working forever for the dead. Actual loaves were placed in burial chambers because the afterlife required food just as life did. Priests presented bread to gods. Soldiers received rations. Workers were paid in grain. Loaf-shaped wooden tokens could record a soldier's ration. Bread crossed every boundary: household and temple, body and spirit, commoner and king, life and death. This is why the strike at Deir el-Medina mattered so much. Those men were not asking the state for a luxury, they were demanding the substance through which the state had promised to keep them alive. The granary stood behind the monument and the loaf behind the pharaoh. Useful things have a dangerous destiny. Eventually, someone tries to own them. Egypt had turned bread into an instrument for organizing a kingdom. Rome would go further. It would build a city so large that bread had to become imperial infrastructure. Either way, if you have made it this far, you probably already see the pattern. This channel is not really about objects, it is about the systems hiding inside them. So if that kind of history interests you, subscribe. Now, back to the strange part, because Rome was about to prove that the most powerful city in the world could also be the most dependent. At its height, Rome may have held nearly 1 million people, most unable to grow food. The surrounding countryside was not enough. Grain had to travel from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt across dangerous sea routes, through ports, warehouses, mills, bakeries, and distribution points. The Annona, Rome's grain supply system, was not a side program. It was a lifeline. Emperors secured shipments, subsidized food, and distributed grain to eligible citizens because hunger in the capital could quickly become political crisis. Ships carried survival. Warehouses stored public calm. Bakers transformed imperial logistics into something people could eat. The phrase "bread and circuses" is often used as if Romans were simply bribed with entertainment and food. The truth is darker. Public grain was welfare, political theater, and urban necessity at the same time. The emperor presented himself as the provider, standing between the crowd and starvation. Rome looked powerful because food arrived from across the empire. But that same network exposed a weakness. Interrupt the routes, lose the harvest, or allow prices to rise, and the capital of the world could begin to panic. After Rome fragmented, rulers still understood that bread could not be treated like an ordinary product. In medieval English towns, officials regulated the relationship between the price of wheat and the expected weight of a loaf. This was the assize of bread. When grain prices rose, the legal loaf could become lighter, but the baker could not secretly reduce it beyond the official measure. Authorities weighed bread, fined offenders, and sometimes publicly humiliated them. The law reveals something easy to miss. A poor household did not buy bread once. It bought bread constantly. A small reduction, repeated day after day, could quietly transfer survival from the customer to the seller. The buyer could not inspect the harvest or see inside the bakery. Trust had to be enforced with scales and punishment. The loaf itself became a public measurement of scarcity. Its size translated distant weather, failed crops, merchant decisions, and local prices into something visible on a family table. The government could regulate weight. It could punish a dishonest baker. But it could not order rain to fall or fields to produce. When harvests failed, bread consumed wages and turned hunger into suspicion. Eventually, that suspicion would walk directly toward a palace. In 1789, political arguments in Paris unfolded beside a more immediate crisis. Poor harvests had driven grain prices upward. Bread absorbed most of an ordinary worker's income, and in the worst moments, a normal supply could consume nearly everything a laborer earned. Families stood in lines. Bakers faced angry customers and unaffordable flour. Rumors spread that grain was being hidden, manipulated, or withheld. The French Revolution is remembered through declarations and fallen symbols, but hunger gave those ideas force. On October 5, thousands of market women and other Parisians marched through the rain toward Versailles. They demanded bread and action from the king. By the next day, the royal family was forced to return to Paris, physically pulled closer to the hungry capital. Most people remember, "Let them eat cake," but there is no reliable evidence that Marie Antoinette said it. The famous insult survives because it fits the story people expect. The real story is darker. No single cruel remark was necessary. The entire food system had become an insult. A monarchy surrounded by ceremony could not convince people that it deserved obedience while their children went hungry. Bread had helped states gather large populations, feed workers, and support cities. Now the same dependence turned private suffering into public revolt. A government could survive criticism. It could survive scandal. But when bread vanished, authority began to look empty. Industry promised to end that danger. Steam power, mills, railways, and urban bakeries offered bread in greater quantities. But mass production created a new kind of distance. Consumers no longer knew the farmer, miller, or baker. They saw only the final surface. Whiteness became associated with refinement and status, so some producers used substances such as alum to make inferior flour or bread appear whiter. Adulteration became scandal because the food chain was difficult to see. Later, roller milling separated grain into components with extraordinary efficiency, producing refined white flour that stored well and behaved predictably in factories. But removing the bran and germ also removed nutrients. By the 20th century, flour enrichment added several nutrients back. The logic was almost perfect in its circularity. Industry removed parts of the grain to make flour stable, pale, and standardized. Then science and policy returned selected elements to reduce the damage. Industrial bread was not simply a mistake. It made food cheaper and easier to distribute across cities. But it changed the location of power. The decisive choices were no longer made mainly at the household oven or local bakery. They moved into mills, laboratories, regulations, factories, and corporations. The loaf looked cleaner and simpler while the system behind it became harder to see. Then, in 1961, the Chorleywood bread process accelerated the final transformation. Intensive mixing let factories produce bread faster and use wheat less suited to slower methods. Fermentation time was compressed. Texture became predictable. Loaves could be designed around machinery, packaging, shelf life, and supermarket demand. Bread no longer had to move at the pace of a household, a village oven, or a patient baker. It could move at the pace of industry. The modern loaf now carries an invisible chain stretching far beyond the bakery. Plant breeding, fertilizer, agricultural policy, commodity markets, grain elevators, industrial milling, enrichment rules, high-speed mixing, energy, plastic packaging, trucking, retail contracts, and national food standards. Most people never see any of it. That invisibility is part of the achievement. A cheap loaf appears without the buyer understanding the harvest, mill, or chemistry. Yet the old dependence has not disappeared. It has only expanded. A disruption in fuel, fertilizer, shipping, weather, war, labor, or prices can still travel through the chain until it reaches the shelf. The object has not changed as much as the system around it. What began as a way to transform wild seeds became a network capable of feeding billions, shaping landscapes, organizing work, and exposing societies whenever it fails. Bread built civilization because bread demanded civilization. It required fields, calendars, storage, cooperation, measurement, transport, and law. Surplus allowed rulers to feed workers and soldiers. Accounting turned rations into bureaucracy. Distribution made giant cities possible. Regulation tried to protect households. Scarcity helped trigger revolt. Industry made abundance ordinary, then hid the machinery that produced it. The workers at el-Medina stopped because their grain did not arrive. Thousands of years later, governments still watch bread prices because the same truth remains beneath the packaging. Civilization was not built only from stone, bronze, laws, or armies. It was built from the promise that somewhere, someone had planted enough grain, stored it safely, counted it honestly, and delivered it on time. A palace can survive without another monument. A government can survive without another victory. But when the bread disappears, authority begins to look like an empty room. Bread built civilization because civilization was the machine we built to keep bread coming. And perhaps that is why, after thousands of years, we still use the same word for food, money, work, and survival. It was never just a loaf. Subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which ordinary food, material, invention, or habit should reveal its hidden history next.